Hey everyone, Nigel and Luke here, and welcome to Crime Zone. Hey everyone, Nigel here. Just a heads up that technically today's video is from last year. That being said, it'll likely be new for the vast majority of you because it was forcibly removed from YouTube when we first uploaded it. If you're interested in learning more about that whole situation, we'll tell you more at the end of the video, but we just wanted to let you know up front for the sake of transparency. Anyway, let's get into it. At around 5 o'clock in the morning on September 18th, 1966, a woman named Valerie Percy heard a noise that momentarily roused her from her sleep. It sounded like breaking glass, followed by much fainter clacking noises, as though someone were walking across a tiled floor. The floor in question was located downstairs from Valerie's bedroom, on the first level of the home that she shared with her husband Charles, as well as their 2 children and her 3 stepchildren. It was a palatial 17-room residence located in the quiet and affluent village of Kenilworth, Illinois, approximately 15 miles north of downtown Chicago. Despite the seemingly bizarre hour for such a noise, the situation barely registered with Lorraine, who in her state of drowsiness attributed it to one of her children dropping a glass downstairs. If not them, then surely it was one of the family's live-in helpers who lived in the servants' quarters above the property's 4-car garage. Almost as quickly as she had registered the noise, Lorraine fell back asleep. It wasn't long, however, before Lorraine was awoken once more, this time by a disturbing sound that was much closer to her own room. These noises were unmistakably being made by another person, though, one who sounded like they might be in a great deal of pain. The realization was enough to make Lorraine get out of bed and head out into the hallway, where she was able to follow the sound across the house to another one of the upstairs bedrooms. It belonged to her 21-year-old stepdaughter, Valerie. When Lorraine opened the door to Valerie's bedroom, she became immediately panicked when she saw what appeared to be a man standing over her stepdaughter's bed. The man was holding a flashlight, which was pointed over Valerie's body. Upon noticing that someone had entered the room, the unknown man reacted quickly, wheeling around and shining his flashlight into Lorraine's eyes. It was at that point that Lorraine screamed and ran back to her own bedroom to find her husband, triggering the home's alarm system along the way. By the time she and Charles returned to Valerie's bedroom, the unknown intruder had fled, and no more sounds could be heard from coming inside. When they turned on the lights, they soon discovered why. Their daughter was dead. This is the story of Valerie Jean Percy, whose murder has become one of the Chicago area's oldest and most perplexing unsolved mysteries. When Charles H. Percy bought his sprawling 3-acre estate on the southwestern coast of Lake Michigan, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. As a child, his family, like many others, had been deeply affected by the Great Depression, and the lavish 17-room Kenilworth mansion seemed completely unattainable. Charles first became familiar with the property while working as an usher at a local theater, where he met the owner of the estate, who was a frequent customer. On one occasion, Charles jokingly told the man that if he ever decided to sell the place, that he should give him a call. Years later, the man actually did. However, by this time, Charles had moved well beyond his days as a theater employee. He had gone on to have a lucrative career at the Bell and Howell Camera Company, eventually being named the company's president and leading it through a period of significant growth and success. In 1950, Charles purchased the Kenilworth estate, with estimates of the sale varying wildly from about $80,000 on the low end to $150,000 on the high end. He would go on to spend thousands more tailoring the property to his liking, adding an indoor swimming pool to the estate's already generous amenities, which included a tennis court, a guest house, and a private beach right on Lake Michigan. It was to be a sanctuary for his growing family. When Charles and his wife Lorraine moved into the estate, they had 3 children, all of whom were from Charles's previous marriage. His first wife had tragically passed away a few years earlier, and the new home, in addition to being a lifelong dream for Charles, seemed to offer the family a new start. It was here that he and Lorraine would welcome 2 more children into the world. The Percys called their estate Windward, apparently because of the strong breezes off of Lake Michigan. By all accounts, it was a picturesque place to grow up, and the family was close. They spent most mornings huddled around the breakfast table together reading Christian Science lessons, as Charles was devoutly religious, and on weekends, all of the children were expected to remain physically active, either by swimming, playing tennis, or doing any number of other activities afforded to them by their lavish lifestyle. Life became even more interesting at Windward when Charles left the private sector and launched a career in politics, joining the Republican Party and serving in an advisory capacity to several noteworthy political figures at the time, such as Dwight Eisenhower and Nelson Rockefeller. As a result, the Percys frequently opened their home to many political figures and business leaders from across the world, who would come to attend weekly parties or competitive tennis matches out on the family court. In short, they were wealthy, extremely well-connected, and were living what was by all accounts an idyllic life. All of this is to say that given the many reasons that the Percy family could have made the news back then, no one would have imagined that one of the family's most enduring legacies in the public memory would become their association with a brutal unsolved crime. In September of 1966, Charles Percy was in the final stages of a heated political campaign. It was his most ambitious race for office yet, an attempt to unseat Democratic incumbent Paul Douglas, who had served in the U.S. Senate for 18 years. Though all of Charles's family members stood behind him in his bid for Senate, one person who took a special interest was one of his 21-year-old twin daughters, Valerie. Valerie had just graduated from Cornell that spring, a bright, ambitious young woman who was well liked by both her teachers and peers. Her first move upon graduation had been to postpone thoughts of grad school and head back to Windward to help work on her father's campaign. Her role specifically was youth outreach, organizing younger supporters and volunteers to help keep up the campaign's momentum. It appears that Charles thought extremely highly of his daughter and her work on his campaign. In one speech, he jokingly referred to Valerie as being as influential in political organizing as then Mayor of Chicago, Democrat Richard J. Daley, saying, quote, "I don't have a political machine, but she does, so I have to depend on her to get the volunteers and the workers. I'll take my daughter anytime to the Democratic political machine in Chicago." The night of September 17th began as an unremarkable night on the campaign trail. Charles had a speech that night at a club in Chicago, while Valerie hosted a dinner party at the family home with several staffers and supporters. The last of these people left at around 10 p.m., after which Valerie went up to her room to watch some television before bed. Sometime just after 11 p.m., Valerie's twin sister Sharon returned home as well, briefly talking to her when she went to drop off something in Valerie's room. The last one to return home that night was Charles, who got in sometime between 12 and 12:30 a.m. He and Lorraine watched television together in their own room for a while before they too went to bed. The only other family member home that night was the Percy's youngest daughter, 13-year-old Gail. Both of their two sons were away. 11-year-old Mark was on an overnight trip with friends, while 19-year-old Roger was away at university in California. At least a couple of live-in helpers would have been in the residence at that time too. However, the number is not exactly clear from reports at the time. Some news articles mention that the Percys had as many as 20 people working for them at the house, though it's likely that only a small number of them would have lived there full-time. Things remained quiet at the house until 5 a.m. that morning, when Lorraine was awoken by the sounds coming from downstairs. As previously mentioned, she initially didn't think anything of this, until she heard more concerning sounds coming from her stepdaughter's bedroom. This is where she encountered the unknown intruder. After pressing the alarm button in her bedroom, which triggered a siren on top of the house, Lorraine and Charles rushed back to Valerie's bedroom and turned the lights on. The unknown man was gone. However, Valerie was now lying in a pool of her own blood. She had been beaten in the head and stabbed numerous times. The police were called, though sadly, Valerie would be pronounced dead at the scene. Understandably, the case immediately drew national attention. Not only was Valerie the promising young daughter of a U.S. senatorial candidate, this was the first murder that had ever taken place in the wealthy village of Kenilworth. As a result, the FBI, as well as other state and local law enforcement agencies, quickly stepped in to provide resources and assistance to the tiny Kenilworth Police Department. Reporters flocked to the scene, as well as terrified neighbors and onlookers from all over, hoping to find out details about the case. The day after the murder, both Charles and his opponent Paul Douglas suspended their campaigns indefinitely, and following Valerie's funeral 2 days after her death, the Percy family left their home and flew to California, apparently as a way to escape the constant attention and to spend some time together processing what had just happened. Police, meanwhile, began to look for clues. When an autopsy was conducted on Valerie's body, it revealed that though she had been stabbed several times, she had been killed by blunt force injuries to the head. These had been inflicted first, police believed, and with some sort of metal weapon with a conical-shaped head. They theorized that this might have been the top of a fireplace poker or a ball-peen hammer that had had one of its ends filed down. As for the stab wounds, they appeared to have been inflicted with some sort of double-edged weapon. While a search of the sprawling 3-acre estate proved to be a monumental task, one thing became clear early on. Nothing of value appeared to have been stolen from the Percy house. This included money, jewelry, and other valuables that were right in Valerie's room, not to mention other places around the mansion. As a result, robbery was quickly ruled out as a motive behind the crime. When investigators searched the ground floor of the house, they found the suspect's likely point of entry, a set of glass French doors on the northeast side of the property leading to the family's music room. A small square portion of screen covering one of the doors had been cut open, along with a section of one of the door's glass panels underneath. This had presumably allowed the suspect to reach in and unlock the French doors from the inside. Based on footprints in the sand found on the beach, both on and off the Percy's property, police suspected that this was the way that the killer might have gotten onto the estate. The culprit could have taken one of the main roads to get into the area, then cut through a nearby ravine or adjacent property, snuck onto the shoreline, and then hopped over the Percy's breakwater onto their private beach. Fingerprints and palm prints were recovered both from the inside and outside of the house, the most interesting of which were bloody palm prints on the spiral staircase leading up to the second floor, as well as ones found on an outdoor porch railing. As a side note, the presence of these bloody prints was not mentioned in the early reporting of the case. For some time, all that was said was that fingerprints and palm prints had been recovered from the scene. Further exploration, both of the outside of the property and the surrounding area, revealed several items that police thought might be of interest. Among them, a single brown men's moccasin, a pocket knife, and a pair of scissors. A wool glove with a leather patch on the palm was also discovered in some shrubs on the property closer to the beach. However, at the time it was found, police did not consider it to be of great significance. This primarily had to do with the fact that the glove was found wet, but it had not rained on the morning of the murder or the night before, suggesting that it had been there for some time. Still, it was taken into evidence. As for a description of the intruder, detectives didn't have much to go on. Lorraine Percy had been the only person to definitely see the unknown suspect, but she hadn't managed to get a good look at him because she was quickly blinded by his flashlight. The only thing she could say for sure was that she believed the killer was a man who appeared to be about 5 feet 8 inches tall and about 160 pounds. He also appeared to be wearing a checkered jacket and dark pants. Several other witnesses would later come forward claiming to have seen strange people or vehicles in the area that night, though these accounts would fail to make significant breaks in the investigation. In most cases, the leads turned out to be nothing, such as a taxi driver who claimed to have seen a green station wagon in the area sometime that morning. The driver of the vehicle was tracked down and subsequently ruled out. In other circumstances, witnesses might have seen something, but there was no clear indication that they had seen the actual suspect. Perhaps one of the more interesting accounts involves a barefoot man who was seen walking along the beach at around 5:45 a.m. on the morning of Valerie's murder. The man was seen near the southern edge of Kenilworth that borders the neighboring village of Wilmette. After walking along the beach, the man allegedly crossed nearby Sheridan Road and disappeared into the surrounding neighborhood. It's unclear if this man was ever identified, but it seems that the only thing that really made him suspicious was his presence in the area about a half an hour after the murder took place. The second witness account worth mentioning here came from an unidentified person who called police and told them that they had witnessed a man standing within the gates of the Percy estate at around 1 a.m. on the morning of the crime. The man was supposedly looking at the house. This was suspicious for two reasons. Firstly, it had allegedly happened after all members of the Percy family were already home and their guests had left for the night. Secondly, their house was the only one on Devonshire Lane, meaning that there would have been no reason for anyone who didn't belong there to go down their street, let alone down their driveway. Again, we were not able to establish in our research if this person was ever identified. However, if he was the suspect, it meant that he hung around the property for at least 4 hours before committing the murder, something that seems strange considering that several of the reports we came across mentioned that the area was well patrolled both by local police and private security. With these first clues in hand, police spent much of the next few days trying to zero in on a suspect, as well as uncover a potential motive behind the killing. Both of these proved frustrating for investigators. While there were early hopes that fingerprint and palm print evidence would lead to the culprit, as police continued to test these against prints taken from the Percy family, their staff, and their friends and house guests, more and more of them were ruled out. Again, there was discrepancy in the reporting record here, as some reports state that eventually all of the prints were matched and ruled out, while others state that a couple of palm prints were not. Some reports outright state that the unknown prints were the ones found in blood, while others do not specify. As far as a motive or theory of the case goes, investigators considered a number of different options. The first of these, of course, related to personal grudges against Valerie or the Percy family, possibly related to Charles's Senate campaign. A couple of former staffers who had been fired from the campaign were questioned, including one man who had reportedly been particularly troublesome due to his drinking habits. However, as far as we know, this line of investigation went nowhere. Likewise, police investigated a rumor that several people had become angry at Valerie after someone she suggested to her father had been promoted within his campaign team. Many on the team reportedly felt that the person had been promoted above other qualified candidates, though authorities did not find anything to suggest this had been connected to her murder. As far as Valerie's life outside of the campaign went, she didn't seem to have any enemies that people were aware of, nor did she have a steady boyfriend or anyone who police believed might have killed her in a so-called crime of passion. Still, many on the investigative team strongly believed that the killer had to have been known to Valerie, or at least to the Percy family, citing the perpetrator's apparent familiarity with the family's estate, as well as the targeted nature of the crime. Supporting this theory was the fact that the killer had managed to sneak on and off of the property almost completely undetected, and that they had seemingly brought the necessary tools needed to get through the French doors. Some investigators even theorized that the killer was so well known to the Percys that they might have actually entered the front door with a key, cutting the screen and glass panel on the music room door as a way of throwing police off of their trail. If you ask us, though, this seems a little far-fetched. While the family did indeed have frequent visitors, some of whom were given keys while staying in the guest house, apparently all of these keys were eventually accounted for. Also, some reports we came across mentioned Charles saying that the front door of the house was bolted that night. If true, the door couldn't have been opened, even with a key. A little more convincing was the fact that the suspect seemed to know exactly where to go once inside the Percy's house, heading for the spiral staircase that led to the second floor and choosing to enter Valerie's room despite the fact that he would have passed both her brother's empty room and Sharon's room along the way. There was also the fact that the family's Labrador retriever did not bark during the time the intruder was inside, potentially meaning that the dog was familiar with him. This was seen as especially important by some because the dog immediately barked at the first police officer to arrive at the scene. However, it's difficult to know what to make of this, since it seems like neither the family nor the police ever came to a definitive conclusion about where exactly the dog was in the house at the time of the murder. In some accounts, the dog was in the main part of the house, meaning the lack of barking could be a potential clue. In other accounts, the dog was locked away in a part of the house leading to the garage, meaning that he might simply not have barked because he was never in the same part of the residence as the killer. The idea of a random killing was also considered by investigators. Proponents of this theory argued that it wouldn't have taken significant familiarity with the Windward estate in order to pull off the crime. In fact, armed with a flashlight, the killer probably could have maneuvered around in the dark quite easily. Some also pointed out that the place where the killer chose to enter, the music room, wasn't actually the optimal place to break in if the crime was targeted. According to them, it would have been easier to break into the home near the indoor pool, which apparently both would have been closer to Valerie's room and would have likely made less noise. The fact that the killer did not know this was therefore seen as evidence that he did not, in fact, have the extensive knowledge of the house that someone who knew the Percy family likely would. One other thing worth mentioning related to motive is the possibility that Valerie had been the victim of a sexual assault. While Lorraine would later tell investigators that she found her stepdaughter's nightgown pulled up when she first went into her bedroom, and it appears that police did explore this motive, as far as we know, no concrete evidence exists suggesting Valerie was assaulted in this way. It's possible, however, that this was simply never reported, and that police have evidence that we do not know about. As days continued to pass, and more reports were released about the Valerie Percy investigation, it became clear that the suspect and the motive weren't the only things that police were unsure about. Soon, the clues themselves began to invite speculation. Things that were immediately seen as possible leads, such as the brown shoe, the pocket knife, and the pair of scissors, were all written off as irrelevant, while the wool glove, initially thought to be unimportant, soon became a central piece of evidence. This abrupt turn happened when investigators discovered fibers that reportedly matched the wool glove both on the section of screen door that had been cut open, as well as in Valerie's bed. However, if the killer had been wearing gloves, why had they allegedly left palm prints in the house? It's possible they took one of the gloves off once inside, and that this is how it was later lost on the property. But again, we just don't know. As for the fact that the glove was wet when it was found, most reports we came across seemed to retroactively explain this by the possible presence of morning dew that day. That being said, we also thought of an additional explanation. In one article we came across, it was mentioned that the Percys had a sprinkler system on their property that would have gone off roughly 10 to 15 minutes before the murder. This fact was only reported in reference to narrowing the timeline of the murder, but perhaps the killer was simply sprayed by the sprinklers as he approached the house and his glove got wet. Maybe this is even the reason why he took it off once inside. As for the footprints on the beach, it seems that investigators didn't really know what to make of them. While it's definitely possible that the suspect walked across the beach to gain access to the property, subsequent reports mention that there were multiple sets of footprints on the beach and in the surrounding area that morning, and that this also wasn't uncommon. At least one other report we came across suggested that police had lost faith in the beach theory somewhat after they could not find any sand in the Percy's house, apparently initially believing the killer would have tracked some inside. Just a few days before detectives began taking a closer look at the wool glove, a search of Lake Michigan yielded another potentially important clue: a bayonet. The weapon had been discovered roughly 40 feet offshore, about 800 feet south of the Percy home. As the bayonet was double-edged, it was theorized that this could be one of the murder weapons, more specifically, the one that had been used to stab Valerie. Still, police insisted that even if the bayonet was used by the killer, they were still looking for a second object, as they did not believe that it was consistent with the blunt force injuries. Unfortunately, the bayonet had been in the water for at least several days by the time it was discovered, meaning that any evidence that could have definitively linked it to the crime had since been washed away. Likewise, subsequent searches of the lake also failed to turn up additional evidence. The area was scoured several times, both by divers and by boats equipped with magnets, but no second weapon was found. As days turned into weeks, fewer concrete details began to be reported about Valerie's murder. Updates continued. However, many of these news stories began to reference the case in terms of how police were attempting to establish if it was linked to other similar murders. In our research, we came across several such news reports from the time, which mentioned the unsolved Valerie Percy case, usually when discussing crimes when another young female victim was involved. None of them were ever linked. In the meantime, the Percy family returned to Illinois, where Charles resumed his Senate campaign. Not long after, though, he would win the Senate race in an upset, and the Percys would move to Washington, D.C., leaving behind their formerly idyllic home, and eventually selling the property to some friends of the family. As years went by, continuous attempts were made to solve Valerie's murder. At least 10,000 people were reportedly interviewed, and more than 1,200 leads were followed. A $100,000 reward was offered. Unfortunately, none of it led to any answers in the case. While police continue to remain more or less silent about any persons of interest in their investigation, this isn't to say that other people haven't advanced their theories about the case over the years. There are two in particular that are worth discussing here. The first of these theories involves a group of burglars with mafia connections who supposedly made a career out of stealing from wealthy homes across the U.S. Among this group were three men named Francis Leroy Hoheimer, Harold James Evans, and Frederick Malcho. Rumors about the men's involvement in Valerie's murder first started to emerge back in late 1969, when Evans was recaptured after escaping from jail less than 2 years earlier. He had escaped alongside Malcho, with whom he had been convicted of several serious crimes in Pennsylvania. While Evans managed to evade police after his escape, Malcho was found dead in the Schuylkill River just 2 days later. It was believed he had fallen from a railroad trestle. Once back in custody, Evans began to insist that Malcho had been behind the murder of Valerie Percy, and that he had confessed to him while they had both been in custody together. Evans' wife backed the story, saying that he had told her this and that the murder had taken place during a botched burglary. More details about this alleged burglary would come in 1973, when the Chicago Sun-Times wrote a series of Pulitzer Prize-winning articles about Valerie's case. This is where Hoheimer was also linked to the case, as it was alleged by multiple people, including a terminally ill mobster named Leo Rugendorf, that he was actually responsible for the murder. Like Evans, Hoheimer shifted the blame to Malcho, saying that he also knew him to be responsible for the crime. By this time, Hoheimer was also in prison, and claimed that back in 1966, Malcho had come to his apartment after the killing and confessed, giving him some clothes to burn. As previously mentioned, the Sun-Times got a lot of recognition for their reporting about the Valerie Percy murder in 1973. However, in the years since, many have raised doubts about their theory of the case. For starters, both Evans and Hoheimer were in prison at the time they pointed to Malcho as the killer, and both, presumably, would have had self-interested reasons to implicate him. Perhaps they thought that they could potentially exchange the information for perks while in jail, whether it was true or not. The two men also would have been far from the first people to falsely implicate or falsely confess in connection with the case. The other big reason many don't believe Hoheimer, Evans, and Malcho were involved in Valerie's murder is because no evidence ever placed them at the scene. Some sources go as far as to claim that the men's prints were compared to the unidentified palm prints found at the Percy estate, and none were found to be a match. However, we were unable to confirm this. At least in the case of Malcho, though, it seems unlikely that he could have been eliminated this way, as by the time Evans named him as a suspect, he would have been dead for nearly 2 years. As for the second major theory in Valerie's case, it comes from a man named Glenn Wall, who wrote a book about the murder in 2013 called Sympathy Vote. In the book, Wall outlines his theory for why he thinks a different suspect, William Thoresen III, was actually behind the murder. According to Wall, Thoresen was born in 1937, the son of a wealthy steel tycoon. Importantly, he reportedly lived just a block away from the Percy residence. By the age of 13, Thoresen had already begun to exhibit troubling behavior when he was warned to stay away from another local family who complained about him. The next year, he was apparently caught inside a different neighbor's home more than once without permission. After several similar episodes, he was placed in the psychiatric ward of a Chicago hospital. He subsequently escaped, returned home, locked himself in his room with a gun, and said that he would kill anyone who entered. By 1966, Thoresen's behavior had only grown more erratic. In one instance, he allegedly tried to stage a double killing at his parents' home and blame it on his father. As for his involvement in Valerie's murder, it does seem that Thoresen not only had the track record to commit such a crime, he also would have been familiar enough with the area to get on and off of the property undetected. There's also one other big reason that Wall thinks Thoresen is the suspect: his apparent penchant for bayonets. His wife was apparently arrested for trying to ship him some just months after Valerie's murder, and more were later found in his San Francisco home during an arms raid conducted by the FBI. Thoresen died in 1970 after being shot by his wife. She was ultimately found not guilty on the grounds that she had acted in self-defense. According to her, on the night of the shooting, Thoresen had confessed to killing 3 people. After sharing this information with her, he allegedly attacked her, saying that she needed to die too, now that she knew his secrets. While none of the 3 murders Thoresen allegedly confessed to had anything to do with Valerie Percy, it's not hard to understand why people like Wall are convinced. Also, apparently Thoresen was spoken to by police at the time, but refused to be interviewed. Unfortunately, as is the situation with the other major theory in this case, Thoresen could never be placed at the scene of the murder, and is now long dead. As one final note on the bayonets, it's worth pointing out that as far as we know, police never came out and 100% confirmed that they believed the one they recovered from Lake Michigan was connected to the crime. The weapon does seem to be consistent with many of Valerie's injuries. However, we couldn't find anything where police were specifically quoted as saying they were confident a bayonet was used in the killing. Instead, most of the sources we saw confidently reporting this information appeared to be doing so based on second-hand information. So where does this leave the case today? The most recent information we could find about the investigation comes from 2016, right around the 50th anniversary of Valerie's murder. At the time, the files in her case were in the midst of a legal battle between a New York lawyer who grew up near Kenilworth and the village's attorneys, who were representing investigators. If you watched our recent story about the Jane Britton case, then you probably already know where this is going. The lawyer, John Kelly, argued that after 50 years the records in the case should be made available to the public, while police and detectives said that any kind of disclosure would jeopardize the ongoing investigation. Kelly argued that it wasn't possible that the case was still being actively investigated by authorities after all this time, and that it was in the interest of both the public and the police to release the records, as this could help to generate new leads. Kenilworth attorneys countered that the case had never been closed, and that they still investigate whatever leads come in. Furthermore, they argued that there were things that police knew about the case that had never been made public or had been incorrectly reported, and that this information was vital to help them eliminate suspects. They claimed this was particularly true in the case of false confessions, as there were details that only they and the true perpetrator would have. This is what we alluded to at the very start of this video. If police really are sitting on a bunch of information that has never been released, it's impossible to know how accurate any of the reporting on this case has actually been. At the end of 2016, the judge in the legal battle ultimately sided with investigators, continuing to allow the police to keep most of what they had under wraps. As for what, if any, leads police are still pursuing in the case, it seems that it's anyone's guess. However, one thing is certain: if they plan to deliver closure to the Percy family, they're running out of time. For some, like Charles, it is already too late. He passed away in September of 2011, just one day before the 45th anniversary of his daughter's murder. At the time of this recording, we have already passed the 55-year mark, and it seems that more and more is being lost to time each day. This includes the Percy house, the setting of the terrible crime, which was demolished in the spring of 2010. Though two of Valerie's siblings said that they were sad to hear of the news of their old house being torn down, in interviews at the time, they said that it was never meant to be a museum or a memorial. Instead, they hold out hope that one day their sister's murder will finally be solved, once and for all. Hey everyone. So, as promised, we just wanted to give you a bit of info about the whole situation with today's video before we wrapped up. As previously mentioned, we actually finished this story more than a year ago, but when we first uploaded it, much to our frustration, it was forcibly removed from YouTube, and we received a hard copyright strike on our channel. After going back and forth with YouTube for a bit, we learned that the person who had made the claim on our video was actually Glenn Wall, the author who you might remember we spoke about earlier on. In particular, Glenn had an issue with 3 images we used in the video, which he stated that he owned the rights to. Now, we could have just removed those 3 images and re-uploaded the video right away when this happened, but we didn't really want to do that. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you might know that we really try to do our best to comply with these kinds of rules, arguably often to the point of paranoia. In this case, we obviously messed up, so we tried to reach out to Glenn multiple times to apologize for the mix-up and see if we could come to some kind of resolution. In one of these messages, we even proposed the idea of a collaboration to see if he would like to potentially make a whole new video with us that he could be a part of. We figured that this way he could benefit from a new audience seeing his work, and that it could also be something you all might find interesting as well. Unfortunately, Glenn not only ignored all of our messages, he continued to go after us, trying to get our content removed on other platforms as well. So yeah, it's been several months now, and since our attempts to extend an olive branch obviously weren't well received, we decided to just go ahead and upload this video again with the stuff that got us in trouble removed. First and foremost, because we think that Valerie Percy's story is one that deserves to be shared, but also because we put a lot of work into making this video in the first place. Needless to say, we're a little disappointed at how this all turned out, but hey, that's just the way life goes sometimes. Anyway, if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate every single one of you out there. Seriously, when frustrating stuff like this happens and we see your words of support and encouragement, it makes a huge difference. And we definitely want you to know that it's very much appreciated. Until next time, take care.